And now joining us on Book TV is Catholic University Professor of Theology, C.C. Pecknold. Professor Pecknold, what do you teach here at Catholic?
I teach Catholic theology. I teach a range of courses. The course which is related to this book is called Political Theology. So I think a lot about the relationship between the church and the state, its historical relationship, and also its theological and political importance for our thinking today.
Well, let's start toward the end of the book, which is democracy connected to Christianity?
Yeah. At the end of this book, I explored the idea of democracy's restless desire, I called it. Why does democracy have this inherent sort of sense of progress? What's it going for? Does democracy have an end? What is the ultimate aim of democracy? And I connect this idea to what theologians talk about as our natural desire for God, that all human beings have this kind of restlessness. St. Augustine in his Confessions begins, the heart's restless until it finds its rest in God. And I ask the question, could that be true of politics too? That democratic restlessness, a certain sort of desire for historical progress, does that also have a kind of restlessness built into it? And is God the end of that? And so I asked the theological question about democracy's restless desire.
Do you answer the question?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I want the question to sort of work on us before I want to immediately answer it. But I suppose if you press me for an answer, my answer would be that, in a sense, yeah, Augustine's answer is the city of God is the final desire for democracy, that democracy is the desire for, in a sense, to participate in power and for everyone to be able to have a full part. And Augustine believes, and Augustine's one of the great inspirations of the book, that the only way in which we could all have a full part in God's divine justice and in God's divine power and love is in the city of God. And so the final answer really is that. The Christian answer is that, that the eternal city, the heavenly Jerusalem, however you want to imagine it, is precisely what democracy is aiming for, but often doesn't know it.
Was Christ political?
Well, he certainly says, my kingdom is not of this world. So that kind of says yes and no, right? So Jesus is political in the sense that he says, my kingdom. And do we say he's not political or that he's suprapolitical when he says, but it's not of this world? And so I suppose throughout this little book is that question about Christianity's vision of the church as suprapolitical, as a church which is, of course, interested in politics, interested in the way in which human beings configure their goods in common for a common life, but also is constantly pushing on that restless desire of an object which transcends politics. And in this sense, we have a vision of Christ as offering political transcendence, as a way of having a vision which shows us the limits of politics.
At what point, Professor Pecknold, did the Catholic Church become super political or political?
Well, I mean, one of the ways I try to answer that question here is the idea of Christ's mystical body. And essential to the book is the idea of what in the Latin language, the corpus mysticum. The mystical body of Christ is this truly human, truly divine body in Christian teaching. Now, if you think about that in terms of Christ's own life, this is central to Christian claims. It's not a surprise. It also, of course, is central to Christian thinking about the Eucharist and is very, very early on in Christian history. So the Eucharist, which is the gift that Christ gives himself, he ascends into heaven, but he leaves the Eucharist, the Last Supper, in which that constitutes the church. And the early church called the Eucharist the mystical body of Christ. They called that the corpus mysticum. Henri de Lubac, a cardinal in the church in the 20th century, made a very interesting discovery about how the church began to change the way it spoke about the corpus mysticum. So by the medieval Catholic Church, by the time of the medieval Catholic Church, you had churchmen talking about the church itself as the mystical body, no longer the Eucharist. Sometimes the Eucharist was called the mystical body, but usually it started to be called the corpus verum, the true body. And the church became the mystical body. Well, if the mystical body is both human and divine, like Christ is human divine, then the church also has a human political aspect and a divine transcendent aspect. And so you see, for example, in popes and in kings in the medieval world, the way in which they exchange back and forth different symbolic attributes. So a king might wear papal shoes. We saw images in the media about Pope Benedict's red shoes. You might see a king wearing papal shoes, and you might see a pope holding a mitre or a king's crown. And so this exchange back and forth in medieval Christendom, in which the king was Christian, the pope was Christian, and you had this sense of temporal power and spiritual power mixing, constantly being exchanged back and forth. That's part of the transfer, de Lubac says, between thinking of the Eucharist as the mystical body to thinking of the church as mystical body. Then the interesting thing occurs that as you think about the church as mystical body, you start to think in entirely social and political terms about that. So the church encompasses the whole order of Europe. You know, if you asked a medieval European what they were, they wouldn't say, I'm French, or I'm German, or I'm Italian, right? They usually say, I'm Catholic, and I'm from this town. And that sense of the church ordering the whole of society meant that the idea of the mystical body could transfer from the Eucharist to the church to society as a whole. And so he tracks, as does the political historian Ernst Kantorowicz, from Berkeley, this history of the migration of the mystical body, as I call it, or the migrations of the holy. And that migration moves you from Eucharist to church to society. And then in the early modern period, I trace how that problematically begins to transfer to state societies, in which early nation-state formations gather up a lot of these ideas about the mystical body and attribute them to early ideas about nation-state formation.
So, Professor, is this a primer for activists, for Christian activists in any way?
I don't think so. I think it's really just, I wrote it for my students so that I wasn't simply throwing a bunch of primary texts about them because I want them to learn the sources, but I wanted them to have some sort of easily digestible guide. So when they're reading the sources, they have some sort of way of linking all the texts and finding a sense of meaning in history, that there is a kind of coherence to the relationship between Christianity and politics, though it might not always be the coherence that we're most comfortable with or even that has always been beneficial.
Liberation theology. Mm-hmm. What was its role in politics?
Liberation theology is not touched upon in the book, but it's an important strand of 20th century Catholic thought emerging out of Latin America. It especially is attentive to how local communities experience the oppression of elite political actors. And it learns a lot from Marxist theory, but isn't reducible to Marxist theory. It learns a lot from Catholic theology, but isn't reducible to Catholic theology. It was certainly problematic in some instances, but for example, Gustavo Gutierrez and Joseph Ratzinger had very fruitful exchanges about the nature of liberation theology in liberating base communities from especially the systemic economic oppression that arises not only out of capitalism, but out of the ways in which states depend on capitalism and promote capitalism, and the way in which the economic and the political, the market and the state perpetuates economic injustice. And so liberation theology pushed that strand, in some ways pushed too hard, at least as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, in certain directions that the church was worried about, but